It's my great honor to call on my father-in-law, the Rabbi of the Palm Beach Synagogue, and to give you some context, he landed this morning from Israel after distributing, I believe, a little over $500,000 to hostages and their families. So please give a warm welcome to Rabbi Scheiner, who will introduce our speaker.
Which one is it?
I'll take it.
Can we get some water?
Yeah.
They got so.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to be here with all of you today. And yes, as Rabbi Scheiner said, I just returned this morning from Israel. And I will tell you that although there's a lot of pain and heartbreak in Israel, the Jewish people are strong and united like never before. It's really an honor to be sitting alongside Professor Alan Dershowitz. First of all, a little known secret, I think we both come from Borough Park, is that correct? I do, yeah. So we grew up in the same neighborhood. And Professor Alan Dershowitz really doesn't need an introduction because he's a household Jewish name. He spent his entire life defending American freedom and freedom of speech, civil liberties, but he is also known as a strong advocate and proponent for Israel, written many books, including his best-selling book, The Case for Israel. And so with a warm welcome to Professor Alan Dershowitz.
Well, thank you. I just want to start off by telling a story about Borough Park. I grew up on 48th Street. 2 doors away from me was Jackie Mason. Down the block was Sandy Koufax. Around the corner was Buddy Hackett. And around the other corner was Elliott Gould. And so they decided to rename 48th Street after the most famous person who ever lived on 48th Street. And guess what the street is named? The Bubova Boulevard, based on the Bubova Rabbi who lives on the corner. And no one in the Bubov congregation has ever heard of any of the other people who lived on the block. Maybe you. So thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful event. I have already learned so much, even being here only a few hours. So thank you. This is wonderful. Your synagogue is wonderful. I was so honored to speak on behalf of your synagogue, and I'm so honored to speak against anti-Semitism and on behalf of Israel. So please ask me your hardest questions.
Okay, so not only do you come from Borough Park, but you learned in yeshiva.
I know I went to yeshiva.
So
the rabbis would disagree with whether I learned. I got a mark of Bain or Knee minus, which means I didn't quite make it to mediocrity. I had something to aspire to. So I was not a good yeshiva student.
There you go. So my first question to you, I guess, is when we ask you what the topic should be, you chose the new anti-Semitism.
That's right.
Now, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs famously said that anti-Semitism is like a cancer. It mutates into one form or another.
That's right.
And as a good yeshiva boy, you know the Torah tells us that the war against Amalek, against evil, will go on from generation to generation. And in 2 weeks, we have the holiday of Purim that we're going to remember Haman, who tried to annihilate the Jewish people 2,500 years ago.
So would you have it too far?
There you go. So please, if you could elaborate on what you mean when you say we're facing a new anti-Semitism. What is new?
Anti-Semitism is as old as recorded history and maybe older than that. But anti-Semitism is brilliant, like viruses. It mutates. It figures out what the environment is, and then it goes after those elements of the environment that can most contribute to the hatred of anti-Semitism. So if you go back to, for example, the period of the beginning of Christianity, Jews killed Jesus. That was the beginning of anti-Semitism. Then Jews poisoned the wells because there was sickness in Europe. Then Jews were communists. Then Jews were fascists. Then Jews were this, Jews were that. Today, of course, there's a whole new vocabulary, and we've heard talk about that. And Jews are now guilty of the worst sins of the second quarter of the 21st century. The crimes, the sins of genocide, of apartheid, of being privileged, of violating the rules of intersectionality, there's a whole new vocabulary that has emerged, but it's the same. It just uses current language, which makes it very popular among young, impressionable college and university students. I want to start by disagreeing a little bit with the prior panel. I learned a great deal from the prior panel, and I think it's wonderful that we attack the extremists, we arrest those who violate the law, we don't expand the First Amendment beyond what its initial intention was, and we go after the people that this panel said we should go after. But that is not the core of the problem. The core of the problem is mainstream university teaching, all protected by the First Amendment, all protected by academic freedom, and impossible to go after as a law enforcement issue. The bad news is that the current academic canon, what is being taught at major universities, and let me tell you, I know a little about this. I've been in higher education now, you're going to wonder about my statement, 70 years. I started out in college in 1955. I was the president of the student government at Brooklyn College. I was then editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Journal. I then became the youngest professor in the history of Harvard Law School. So I know what I'm talking about when I talk about the academic canon. What is being taught today, not by extremists, but by your children's friends, by your friends' children, by mainstream academics, by Jewish academics, by academics who in shul call themselves Zionists, but out of shul won't defend Israel. What is being taught today on college campuses as part of mainstream courses is the essence of anti-Semitism. Students are learning anti-Semitism in virtually every class, every course, and in every lecture. Today, I'm just going to make a list of things that are going on in American universities today, and they will be familiar to you. And if I continued and read you the whole list, I think we would be going into the next panel. But Jews are accused of having privilege. That's a dirty word, having privilege. Jews are accused of being successful. Oh my God, success? No, we don't want meritocracy in our schools. We want DEI. We want diversity, equity, and inclusion, but certainly not meritocracy. Everything that Jews are good at, we are attacked for. What is the group in America that has most benefited through meritocracy? Obviously, it's been Jews. What is the country in the world that is most benefited by meritocracy? Tiny little country the size of New Jersey with no oil and no resources. That's the country of meritocracy, that startup nation. So privilege, intersectionality, critical race theory, which is uncritical race theory. You can't criticize race theory. DEI, race-based affirmative action, internationalism, relating to the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, the United Nations. Selective anti-nationalism. We hate nationalism, except when it's Palestinian nationalism. That we support. Selective nationalism. Palestinianism, which means that the only rights that are recognized on college campus today are the rights of Palestinian people. You never hear about the Kurds. You never hear about the Tatars. You never hear about the Uyghurs. You never hear about any group. It's only Palestinianism, which is simply another word of describing anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Orientalism, a phrase concocted by Edward Said at Columbia University. Qatarism. Qatarism, what is that? It's how Qatar is funding so many American universities in ways that are less than visible. Socialism and communism. Let's remember, too, that until the Soviet Union changed on a dime in the early 1960s, when they looked out the window and discovered, wow, Arabs have oil, they have the Suez Canal, Jews have sand and oranges, we're not going to support Israel anymore. That changed on a dime, and suddenly all the communist parties in Europe that were pro-Israel turned against Israel. All the American liberal left groups even the American Civil Liberties Union, the National Lawyers Guild, all turned on a dime against Israelism. Human rights. I have devoted my life to human rights. Human rights have become today human wrongs. Human rights have been weaponized against Israel, against everything that Israel does. The Civil Liberties Union, National Lawyers Guild, NGOs. We all grew up thinking, wow, NGOs are so wonderful. Virtually every NGO today is anti-Israel. When you look at what happened on October 8th, the most important day in modern Jewish history, October 8th, not October 7th. October 7th was a disaster. It was a one-day horrible disaster. October 8th told us where we really were in the world when Amnesty International at Harvard blamed it all on Israel, and all the left-wing groups around the country blamed everything on Israel before Israel fired a single shot in the Gaza Strip. Student governments. Oh, who's not in favor of student governments? We want people to be able to elect student presidents. Every student government in the country virtually has turned out to be anti-Israel. Left-wing faculty, self-regeneration of how the faculty reinvents itself, Medor Lador, from every generation to every generation. The left-wing, hard-left, anti-Zionist, anti-Israel faculty replicates itself and makes it impossible to have any changes. DEI administrations, it goes into high schools. Look what's going on in the private high schools, the elite private high schools in New York, Friends Academy, Dalton, all the schools that we all want to send our children and grandchildren to. They have become the centerpiece of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and they're sending our kids to college with those attitudes. The media, New York Times, CNN, nobody should be surprised at the New York Times. The single most dangerous anti-Jewish publication in modern history. It turned against the Jews during the Holocaust. It turned against the Jews during the establishment of the State of Israel and opposed the establishment of the State of Israel. It is the newspaper of record, and it is a disgrace. CNN, MSNBC, others. Europe. We heard about Europe. Ireland. We all have Irish-American friends. Most of our Irish-American friends in America are very pro-Israel. You go to Ireland, it is the single most anti-Semitic state in all of Europe, and it didn't start here. It started in the Second World War when the Irish government supported Hitler and wouldn't allow British transports to land in Ireland. And now I want to talk to you for a minute in the most disturbing way about the greatest enemy today that Jews face, the greatest enemy that Israel faces. One word: Jews. Jews. We are our own worst enemy. When we see these arguments by ethnic identity, oh, Chomsky is Jewish, so he can't be an anti-Semite. Finkelstein is Jewish, so he can't be an anti-Semite. No, we're seeing such self-hatred within the Jewish community. We're seeing it in various different forms. Some of it's overt, Finkelstein, all that stuff. The cartoon that was talked about before, written by, of course, a Jewish Danziger, who is overtly anti-Jewish and anti-Israel. We are our greatest enemy. Pogo the cartoon once said, "We have seen the enemy and he is us." I see it all the time. Organizations like Temple Emmanuel in New York, which forbids me from speaking and making a pro-Israel speech, but pays Peter Beinart $25,000 to deny Israel right to exist. The 92nd Street Y, which bans speakers like me and encourages anti-Israel speakers. And these organizations have the imprimatur of the Jewish community. So people say, oh my God, why should we ever invite fill in the blank to speak on college campuses? The Jewish organizations won't even have him. So we have a real problem of our own. And so I'm not going to be as optimistic as the last four speakers. We have survived in the past. That doesn't mean we're going to survive in the future. Our destiny is in our hands. It's not in the hands of some historic compulsion that we will always survive and that the joke will always end with "let's eat." No, We did not survive the Holocaust. We did not survive. We failed the Holocaust. The Jewish community of Europe ended forever, permanently. The Yiddish culture ended permanently. There are remnants of it today on American campuses, in American cities, but the Jewish culture of Europe, one of the greatest cultures in the history of humanity, ended. We lost that fight. And we lost it perhaps in part because of Jewish leadership. Because Jewish leadership, Rabbi Wise wouldn't stand up to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and many other Jews, people who law firms are named after today. Proskauer hated other Jews. So many German Jews in New York wouldn't lift a finger for Jews in the Holocaust. And so for me, the negative message is this. Look, the Talmud says that prophecy ended with the destruction of the Second Temple. I'm not going to argue with that, and I'm not going to claim to be a prophet. But I am going to tell you there's one easy way of predicting the future. You look at who are the leaders in American colleges and universities today, and you know that 20 years from now, thank God it'll include people like Shabbos Kestenbaum, but it will also include many of the anti-Israel leaders. They will be members of Congress. Kestenbaum will be a minority member of Congress, but the majority will consist of people today who are creating this problem on college campuses. So yes, I can predict the future. If we don't change it, we will see what's going on in elite high schools today, colleges tomorrow, universities, law schools, and medical schools the day after tomorrow, Congress 5 years, 10 years from now, the presidency 20 years from now. We are on a dangerous trajectory. The trends are all going in the wrong direction, and we have an obligation to change that. We must change Jewish leadership, we must change Jewish attitudes, and we must change our priorities. My wife and I made a decision. On October 8th, we have a family fund. We contribute widely to educational, artistic, everything else. We've changed that. Our priorities now are one and only the Jewish people in Israel. I contribute all of my time and all of my money and all of my resources to the Jewish people and to the state of Israel. And I think that many should follow and begin to prioritize. I think you have to prioritize in terms of elections. I'm not going to here make a speech about who I voted for, who I didn't vote for, and who I will vote for. But I will tell you that my votes will be determined, will be dependent on my grandmother's old statement. I remember coming back from a game and saying, oh my God, the Brooklyn Dodgers won. And my grandmother says, yeah, but was it good or bad for the Jews? And that's the question that I ask today primarily. Is it good or bad for the Jewish people, for our survival? Is it good or bad for the survival of Israel? The United States will survive. That is for sure, no matter who is in charge. We have a system of checks and balances. It's working. The United States will survive. Israel's survival is not guaranteed. We can look to the Torah. We can look to the Psalms of David. But if we look to the Psalms of David, remember what Hashem told us. Hashem oz li'amo yitain. God will give the Jewish people oz. Hashem yivarech et amo b'shalom. Only through oz, only through strength will the Jewish people survive. We have learned the lesson of history that morality is not enough. We had morality on our side in the 1930s and the 1940s. We did not survive. We have had morality on our side on October 7th. It was a disaster. Yes, strength without morality is no good, but morality without strength is also no good. So I urge all of you to devote all of your resources to strengthening Jewish communities, whether it be the shul in Palm Beach, whether it be Jewish events at places like Harvard and Yale. You can pick and choose which way to prioritize your intellectual, your financial, your physical resources, but we must prioritize Jewish survival. Thank you.
And you know,
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dershowitz.
Hey,
You mentioned the October 8th, the day after that, one of the student bodies at Harvard condemned Israel and blamed Israel for the atrocities of October 7th, even before the first shot was fired in Gaza. You spent 50 years at Harvard as a professor, and you left 10 years earlier, 2013. You concluded your professorship at Harvard. Were you surprised that in the 10 years since you left, had things changed that much, or did you see this coming from the day you were there?
Not from the day I was there. Look, I got there in 1964. I was the first Jewish Jew in Harvard's history. That's not my term. That's a term that described me. There were many Jews previously at Harvard. They wore crimson underwear. They did everything in their power to assimilate and become part of Harvard. I wore my Jewishness on my sleeve. The first 2 years I was there, I threatened to publicly resign if they excluded Jews from being presidents or deans of colleges. I fought for Jewish values. Even before that, this wasn't a golden age. I graduated law school in 1962. I told you what a bad yeshiva student I was, so I can now tell you what a good law student I was. First in my class, editor-in-chief, Supreme Court law clerk, turned down by 32 out of 32 Wall Street firms. I didn't even get an interview. But I did get a job at Harvard, and I saw. And in 1990, I wrote a book called Chutzpah, in which I predicted this. I predicted that we are seeing trends in education that are going to lead to the left, particularly the left. And I was a person of the left. We were going to see the left moving away from the values that undergird Israel and Jewish values. And the reason it's so dangerous, it's the teachers themselves and a lot of the students don't think that they're involved in anything anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic. They're just in favor of these other values that are inherently anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish. It's so deep into the academic culture that I do think that it was foreseeable even 30 or 40 years ago. It's gotten much worse. And of course, October 7th was a traumatic and dramatic event which revealed so much of what was beneath the surface. And so I think we have a much bigger battle to fight. I taught at Harvard 50 years. I left there 10 years ago, exactly 10 and a half years ago. I have not been invited back to speak at all at Harvard about Israel. The one time that I was invited back, it was by Chabad, and they had to move my speech off campus for fear of a danger to my life. I have not been invited to speak at Yale. I have not been invited to speak at any of these major schools because they know that a speech of the kind or statements of the kind I made today would result in physical violence directed against me and other forms of violence directed against those who sponsored me. I just learned the other day that an assistant professor without tenure at a major university has just not had his contract renewed because he invited me to speak about Israel at that college campus. And that is going on today. And so it's a much deeper problem. It's not a problem of radicalism. It's the issue that the elements that create anti-Semitism have become normalized on American university campuses. They are part of the core curriculum. They are a central part of the canon that is being taught today, and we have a really difficult job to do in undoing that, but we have to start now.
Professor Dershowitz, you may have seen, I don't know if you read the New York Times. Hopefully you don't.
I do. I read it too, just for the same reason I work at MSNBC.
A couple of hundred rabbis and other creative artists took out a full-page ad in the New York Times saying, "We Jews say no to ethnic cleansing," responding to Donald Trump's idea of relocating the people of Gaza. And I wanted to ask you a twofold question.
Sure.
If you feel comfortable commenting on President Trump's proposal, and how would you respond to those signatures who said that what he's proposing is ethnic cleansing from a legal perspective?
So I went through the list of the 300, and I knew about 200 of them. And most of them don't recognize Israel's right to exist. They are anti-Zionist rabbis, most of them Reform rabbis. Some of them are just Hollywood ignoramuses who will follow any course. These are the same people who wore to the Oscar the bloody hand. Some of them saying, "Oh, we didn't know it was a function of the lynching of innocent Jews. We just wore it." So it was a horrible list of 300 people. But some of them were, Rabbi Madeline of a major synagogue, conservative synagogue in New York, signed on to that list because many of his congregants probably agree with that. So look, a Jew has to look in a very complicated way at moving people. Why? We are the poster child for being moved. From the time there was a Jewish state ending in 70 AD until 1948, or you want to start with Zionism, 1898, or whenever you want to start, we were people who moved around. There's the old joke Elie Wiesel used to tell about a friend of his who wanted to become an American. So they asked him in his immigration conference, what country were you from? He says, country. I don't know country. What do you mean? They said, well, what does your birth certificate says? It says Romania. What does your draft say? It says Austria-Hungary regime. What does your immigration paper say? It says the Soviet Union. So you must have moved around a lot. No, I always lived in Sighet. Countries just changed names, but Jews moved everywhere. And I have a very strong view that place is not as important as peace. That location is not as important as life. And that if it takes the movement of people, more people were moved when the Aswan Dam was built by Nasser. In 1945, 3 million ethnic Germans were moved out of Sudetenland because they had contributed to the disruptions that led to the Second World War. And as a result of that movement, we've had peace in Europe till Ukraine. 15 million Muslims and Hindus were moved after the India-Pakistan breakup. How many Jews had to move out of North Africa in 1948? So movement of people is a terribly disruptive thing. It's difficult. You have to leave. You don't leave your culture behind. You take your culture with you. When Jews had to move, when our grandparents and great-grandparents moved from the shtetls in Poland, they didn't leave the Torah behind. They took the Torah with them. They took their values with them. So if you can achieve real peace by temporary relocation of people, I'll give you an example of a variant of the Trump plan, which I have proposed to my friends in the administration, and that is empty out half of the Gaza Strip, say the southern half, make every single person leave and go to the north for 2 years. For 2 years, give them good housing in the north for 2 years. During that period of time, you completely clean out every single tunnel, every single military base. You put concrete on the ground. You put electrodes all over. You make it impossible ever to rebuild the tunnel structure. And then you readmit people who are not in any way associated with Hamas. Then you do the same thing with the north. You bring the people to the south. So it's a disruption for 4 years. Maybe something could be done about Gaza. I'm not wedded to that plan. I'm not wedded to any plan. I am thankful that we have a president who is willing to at least look outside the box and beginning to violate Albert Einstein's definition of insanity. If you do the same thing over and over again, you're always going to get the same result. So I applaud the president for coming up with new ideas. I hope he remains open-minded to variations of those ideas. But in the end, peace and life. Do you know what Rabbi Soloveitchik said once before the 1967 war? They asked him, if it takes the killing of human beings, both Jews and Arabs, to regain the Kotel, would it be worth it? And he said no. He said human life under Jewish law is worth more than any location, even the Kotel. And you then apply that to Gaza, which has no religious significance to any people or no nationalistic significance. Gaza was an orphan. It belonged to Egypt. Egypt didn't want it. The Camp David Accords wanted it to go back to Egypt. Most of the people who live in the Gaza are not Gazans. They're originally from Egypt, some from southern Lebanon. You you have to think creatively about a situation that has not been able to be resolved by non-creative thinking. So let the thinking continue. Let no one reject these ideas, and let these damn rabbis learn something about Judaism, about the value of human life, and stop mixing politics into, and stop disguising their left-wing political groups underneath their rabbinic degrees.
Thank you, Professor Dershowitz. How do you understand the enduring nature of anti-Semitism? How do you comprehend why there is so much hatred directed to one small group of people that have contributed so much to humanity, as you said earlier? How do you make sense of it?
Well, you've given us the answer. The answer is because Jews have survived, because they have endured. As Mark Twain said, in the last third of the 19th century, every other civilization that was contemporaneous with Jewish civilization has disappeared off the face of the earth. Jews have survived, and they've survived against all odds. They have used limited resources to achieve great results. There's an enormous amount of jealousy, but it has been a constant throughout history. You know, Joseph becomes the favorite of the Pharaoh and generates anti-Semitism. Mordecai becomes the favorite of the king, Ahasuerus, and that leads to a potential genocide. We'll celebrate how the Jews fought against that. But there's never been a time. I thought there was a short period, kind of post-Holocaust guilt period. It doesn't start in 1960s because, again, Jews were not getting jobs in law firms and businesses, etc. But maybe you could say from the beginning of the civil rights movement in the 60s till maybe 2000, there was a golden age. That age is over. We're back to what has been the tradition for the last 2,000 years. First thing is you hate the Jews. Second, you try to come up with an explanation or a justification for why you hate them. But it's not going to change because you're going to hate them. And we have to fight back with every resource that we have available to us. I agree with what Shabbos and some others have said, too. Don't ever worry when they say Jews control the media, Jews control this, Jews control that. There was an article today that there are more Jewish billionaires than from any other ethnic group. God bless them. They made it on their own. They overcame all kinds of discrimination. They don't have oil. They don't have natural resources. You know, they have chachma and dot and bina, and we've used all of those to our tremendous advantage. And as the comedian Elon Gold says, you know, you go to any city in the country, in the world, and you see every hospital is named after Schwartz and Bernstein. We are the most charitable and giving people in the world to other people. And what do we get for it? We are privileged, and therefore it isn't. You're allowed to go after people of privilege. And so don't ever give up your privilege. You earned it. Don't ever send your kid to the second best university if they can get into the first best university. Teach them how to fight back. Teach them to develop the ability to respond. But don't sacrifice what we've earned, what we've worked so hard to earn in order to satisfy other people who we will never satisfy.
Many of you may have known this, but at one point Israel asked Professor Dershowitz to become an Israeli citizen and be their Israeli ambassador to the UN, which he turned down that opportunity. But my question to you is, I just returned from Israel this morning, visited many of the hostages that just came home in the past few weeks, including the 4 hostages that were just released on Saturday. We got to visit them in Bellinson Hospital.
Wonderful.
And of course, they all want all the hostages to come home. There's still 60 more hostages, half of them alive, half of them not alive, tragically. Today was the tragic funeral of the Bibas family of Shiri, Kfir, and Ariel. The path forward to bring home all the hostages. Have we made mistakes along the way in freeing our hostages? And what should be the focus now of Israel, but more importantly, American Jews, to bring about the release of all of our hostages?
First of all, don't criticize people who have been put in impossible positions by Hamas terrorism. There's no good answer. Do you stop fighting Hamas and let them take over Gaza again? which would maybe have brought back some hostages earlier? No, but do you continue to fight Hamas, get as many hostages as possible? I refuse to criticize the people who have to make those decisions. I have sat, as you probably many of you know, I'm a close friend of the Netanyahus. I've known Bibi since 1970 when his name was Ben Natai, and he was a student at MIT, and we were good friends. And so I've had dinner. I have Shabbos dinner at their house whenever I go to Israel, and I usually have to deliver the Devar Torah, which is the hardest part of the job. But whenever I go there, I have to walk through crowds of protesters, including people whose children are hostages, and they're screaming and yelling, and I don't blame them. They have to put their children first, their parents, their cousins first. But the Prime Minister of Israel can't put them first. He can't put himself first. He has to put the nation and the future of Israel first. So I'm not going to be critical of decision makers. I think they've all done the best they can, and it's all Hamas's fault. Let me be very categorical. Every single death, whether it's 40,000 or 20,000, we don't know the numbers. We know the numbers are way exaggerated. Every single civilian death is solely the responsibility of Hamas, solely the responsibility. If they hadn't committed the genocide of October 7th, there would have been no deaths. If they had laid down their arms, there wouldn't have been any deaths. If they hadn't hidden their hostages among civilians, if they hadn't hidden their rockets among civilians, there would be no civilian deaths. But even with all of that, Israel's ratio of civilian deaths to combatant deaths is better than any other country in the history of modern warfare, even if you take the Hamas figures. And yet they are the most condemned country, condemned at the UN, condemned at the International Court of Justice, condemned at the International Criminal Court, condemned at universities. Did you hear a single university have a protest about the killing of the Beavis babies? No, I must have missed it. You don't get those events. You only get condemnation of Israel. And so we have a very, very hard job to do. Thank God we have great rabbis who put the Jewish people where they deserve to be put and devote their energies. And you can tell a great rabbi if they have a great congregation. And this rabbi has the most wonderful congregation, which is a credit both to the rabbi and to the congregation.
And to the Rebbitzin.
Of course, always the Rebbitzin. And so may you go from strength to strength, and may you go from goodness to goodness.
Thank you. I have one or two more questions. I know we're running out of time.
Sure.
But my next question is, you wrote a book called Chutzpah.
Yeah.
And do you think Jews have enough chutzpah today in fighting anti-Semitism?
No. I started out my book in 1990 saying Jews don't have enough chutzpah. And certainly what chutzpah they had in 1990, much of it has been lost. It took another politician, the senator from, I forget what state in the West, just wrote a book called Chutzpah. He doesn't even attribute anything to me in his introduction, but he wrote a book called Chutzpah. And let there be many more books called Chutzpah. We need more Chutzpah.
What would be an example of chutzpah in fighting anti-Semitism?
Well, we have to stand up to university presidents. We have to insist that there be no double standards. You know, it's not enough to say free speech. Yeah, we all support free speech. I devoted my life to free speech, but we can't have free speech for me but not for thee. And that's what we have on college campuses today. No university campus would tolerate what is being said about Jews if it was being said about other minorities. So we need to have a single standard. And I know I participated in an indirect way in the settlement of the Harvard suit. I was consulted by the lawyers who brought the suit. And the one thing I demanded is that Harvard accept the principle of a single standard. And I think that we need more chutzpah in demanding that we not be treated differently than any other group.
Final question, Professor Dershowitz, and thank you for coming up all the way from Miami to be with us today. And my final question to you is, I just came back from Israel, and one of the remarkable things is that every single hostage I met with that came out of captivity told me that they deepened their connection to God, to Judaism, to faith, to the Jewish people during those 15 months of captivity. stories that are just unbelievable. Young girls who were captured, those soldiers who fasted not only on Yom Kippur, but fasted on Tisha B'Av and Tzom Gedalia in captivity. A Passover Seder in the tunnels by hostages who sang V'hi Sha'amda, the prayer that God stands up in front of their captors. And we talk about what we can do to fight anti-Semitism, of course, directing your financial dollars to Jewish causes, getting more involved, having chutzpah. How do you see the correlation between deepening our faith and our connection to Torah and Judaism in combating anti-Semitism?
It's a fascinating connection. I first learned about it through my client. You probably know that I defended Anatoly Sharansky, Natan Sharansky, for the eight or 9 years that he was in prison. And people ask me all the time, what is the most important case of my life? And I always say, defending Natan Sharansky. And the biggest fee I ever got, I defended him pro bono, was when he threw his arm around me, having been released, and he whispered in my ear, Baruch Matir Asurim, blessed are those who free the imprisoned. But he told a story. They were going to celebrate a Seder on Pesach coming up soon. And they scrounged around and they found a little bit of wax they could make a candle out of. And they found a little bit of flour that they could put on a rock and make a matzah. But they could not find maror. They could not find a bitter herb. And Sharansky said, I don't know what we're going to do. You can't have a Seder without bitter herb. And one of the Orthodox people who were prisoners in Prague said, the maror is a symbol of suffering. Here we have the actual suffering. We don't need the symbol. And I think that was true of these brave and bold hostages. And we'll never know all the stories. We now know that this young man who was shot in the head just days before he could have been released helped hostages. We'll never know all the stories of the Warsaw Ghetto. We'll never know all the stories of Jews who didn't make it into the Haggadah, or Jews who didn't make it into the books that have been written, and there'll be books written about the captivity. And we have to remember every single Jew who perished al Kiddush Hashem, or who survived. And it's so important to understand the connection between Jewish values and survival. It's not perfect. And here I'm going to end on a note that may be inconsistent with what some of you think, but we have there's a famous story, I think it was the Saadia Gaon, who once said, pray to God for miracles, but don't count on the miracles. You have to make sure that you have the input, that you do what you have to do. And so, yes, faith is really, really important, particularly in times of difficulties and trauma, but always also depend on what you can do, how you can help, what you can contribute to world peace, to peace with Israel, to peace and security in the United States. We live in a wonderful time. We live in a wonderful, blessed country. You can argue with who's in charge. You can argue with who are the judges. You can argue with anything you want. We are a great country. Israel is a great country. The world that we live in, troubled as it is a wonderful, wonderful place. And our job, Tikkun Olam, is to make it better, to improve the world. And we're doing an okay job, but we can do better. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Dershowitz. With heartfelt thanks for your contributions at the Countering Anti-Semitism Summit, we'd like to give you a beautiful Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Father.
Pirkei Avot.
That's what's for you.
Thank you.
We're going to give you one. Thanks for the point right there. We're good at best. Yeah. We're going to come down there.